me, it instantly made me feel like it was this very ivory tower concept. My name's Adam Markowitz, and I'm a furniture maker and a designer, as well as a practicing architect. I graduated with a Master of Architecture about 10 years ago, and I worked as an architect for a short period before retraining as a furniture maker and furniture designer. And I've been operating my independent furniture making and architecture practice for the last 5 years. I recall was used very heavily during my studies by lecturers and by tutors. And so to me, it instantly made me feel like it was this very ivory tower concept that had little relationship to functional practice. One of the challenges of the design education thing is that you're often taught to, creating this kind of design identity as a student. You're really encouraged to find strong beliefs and a strong, idea behind this conceptual methodology of the parti. But the reality is that most of what we do is service-based, and we are a service industry. So, in my mind, these sort of guiding elements of parti, of concept, are guiding, but they can't always override practicalities. And very often the practicalities will need to lead the way because you are ultimately providing a service to a client. And if you're too minded about the kind of core concepts, you won't have the flexibility to be able to kind of duck and weave those problems. Sometimes the solution to those problems can be drawn from the core concept. I designed a house recently, and there were a number of guiding elements that were influencing the structural layout, overlooking because of neighbours, residential setbacks, which are forcing design decisions that may not have anything to do with the core concept. My core concept in terms of designing and making is that relationship between hand and mind. So as architects, you're kind of distanced from the physical making quite heavily, and you focus very heavily on, drawing lines on a page, and there's no feedback loop necessarily from the physical reality of what's happening. And that was something that when I graduated and became an architect, I kind of became a little disenchanted with, because I'd always been quite interested in making things with my hands. And architecture for me seemed like this, you're a designer, but you were dealing with the built form, and it seemed like this unity. But the reality was it was quite disconnected between designing and making. So in my furniture practice, I'm really interested in how a hands-on approach can feed back into the conceptual process. I think that there is a kind of dialogue that happens between the physical practice of making and the forms that you can discover and the physical realities of just working with tools that I guess are intimately woven with a conceptual methodology. And that if you're purely working in digital realms, or even to a lesser extent with just pen and paper, you're not able to conceive completely what's physically possible, because you're not working in physical reality. When I'm designing, especially furniture, I'll be moving fluidly between modeling things on Rhino, hand sketching, jumping into the workshop and roughing things out of Pine mock-ups. So it's a very fluid process where I'm moving between everything. If I'm in the workshop and I think, this curve's really nice and that thickness of leg is nice, and then I go machine it up and I look at it, sometimes you hold it in your hand and it looks completely different to how it looks in Rhino. and you can just tell straight away. And so, yeah, I'm interested in that feedback loop, and really, I'm interested in the idea that what happens in the machine shop is just as legitimate in a conceptual method as picking up a pencil and sketching a parti diagram. In terms of the conceptual methodology, I had in my mind that I wanted to achieve an incredibly light table. And part of this was having worked as an architect in practices that were doing a lot of inner city apartments, which are pretty small. And having seen apartments where they put big blocky tables in there, it really makes them feel really small and pokey. Whereas if you can put a light looking table, it takes up the exact same amount of footprint in the space, but it actually makes the space feel more spacious and light. So that was the idea of, keeping that edge really crisp and floating the top off the legs so that you had light sort of coming through. And then a lot of it was informed by historical precedents. I could point you at a number of mid-century tables by Danish masters who had similar details. A number of those details I wasn't the first person to come up with, but putting them together in that particular arrangement and in that particular fashion, there's a lot of things in that table that a Danish designer would never do. And there's a lot of things in that table that, a traditional Australian furniture maker wouldn't do or wouldn't have done back when I designed it. The table I made for the hanging studio, the first design I did for that got pretty well canned by the people I was dealing with. I had this idea of kind of Knights of the Round Table meeting room. So the brief was, I want a meeting room for 12 people to sit in this space, which is kind of the crowning space of the new Melbourne School of Design building. The first design I did was a round table. They didn't really like it. And the reason they didn't like it, and I was looking back on it now, and it's actually quite a nice design, but they were right. They didn't like it was because, one, it was for a meeting room of 12 people, but it was also designed to accommodate smaller meetings of, say, 2 to 3 or 5 to 6 people. And if you're 5 to 6 people having a meeting around a large round table, it's a bit awkward because you're all sort of sitting side by side. And if you're, say, 3 people. And the other critique they gave to me was that it was a bit generic, like it really could go in any space. And what they wanted was a design that specifically spoke to that particular space. I took that to heart, and then I went back and looked at a whole bunch of historical precedents and references, and I interrogated some of the core elements of the building, which is what John Wardle and NADAA had been trying to do with it. And then I looked specifically at the plan form of the room and tried to get that to sort of generate some formal approaches. And then I also looked at the idea of kind of meeting sizes and clusters of people. And I used all of those different elements to sort of generate the final design and the shape. Probably in my initial response to the brief, I'd been too rigid in my conceptual approach, and that the feedback from the client had allowed me to, I guess, loosen up, but still retain some elements of the initial conceptual approach. In the original design, there are still a couple of elements that survived through to the final design, and there are other elements which just got jettisoned. So the question is, the parti was that, the ability to address the feedback from the client, was it some of the initial responses to the room. It's quite a complex assemblage of influences. There's a good quote by Eisenhower, who was an American general in World War II. He said, when he's preparing for battle, he finds plans are useless, but planning is indispensable. I think that's the way a designer needs to look at things. The parti is the planning, but when you're actually sort of faced with reality, it doesn't always work. but being able to draw on that to find the solutions is the skill of the designer.